The most powerful alchemy doesn't turn lead into gold, it transforms pain into power. This profound insight from Carl Jung captures the essence of what we'll explore today. The remarkable process through which our deepest emotional wounds can become sources of extraordinary strength and wisdom. Have you ever wondered why some people seem to emerge from devastating experiences not just intact, but somehow more alive, more authentic, and more powerful than before? Why certain individuals can transform childhood trauma, heartbreak, betrayal, or loss into profound compassion, creativity, and purpose? What separates those who remain trapped in cycles of suffering from those who transmute their pain into something precious and powerful? The answer lies in what Jung called emotional alchemy, a profound psychological process that mirrors the ancient alchemical quest to transform base metals into gold. Just as medieval alchemists worked with physical substances, Jung recognized that we can work with the raw material of our emotional pain, transforming it through specific psychological processes into sources of wisdom, strength, and meaning. I remember working with a client, let's call her Sophia, who came to me after a devastating series of losses. Her marriage had ended, her career had collapsed, and her health was suffering. "I feel like my life is nothing but pain," she told me. "I've tried everything to escape it. Distraction, positive thinking, medication, but nothing works. I'm beginning to think I'll never feel whole again." What Sophia couldn't see, what many of us can't recognize when we're in the depths, of suffering, is that her pain wasn't just a problem to solve or a condition to escape. It was raw material for a profound transformation that was already trying to happen within her psyche. The very intensity of her suffering signaled not just breakdown, but the potential for breakthrough, if she could learn to work with her pain alchemically rather than merely trying to eliminate it. In the next few minutes, I'm going to reveal Jung's rarely discussed method for transforming emotional pain into psychological gold. I'll share the 7 signs that indicate you're already in this alchemical process, even if you haven't recognized it. And most importantly, I'll explain specific techniques that can help you consciously participate in this transformation rather than remaining its passive victim. By the end of this video, you'll understand that your deepest pain may actually contain the seeds of your greatest strength, not despite your suffering, but because of how you transform it. To understand emotional alchemy, we first need to understand Jung's view of psychological transformation. Unlike many modern approaches that focus primarily on symptom reduction or returning to a previous state of functioning, Jung saw psychological development as a spiral path of continuous evolution, one that necessarily includes periods of suffering and disintegration as essential stages in the journey toward greater wholeness. Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." This perspective fundamentally changes how we approach emotional pain. Rather than seeing suffering simply as a problem to eliminate, Jung recognized it as a potential catalyst for transformation, a necessary, if difficult, part of the journey toward psychological maturity and wholeness. The question becomes not how to avoid pain, but how to work with it alchemically, how to engage with it in ways that transform rather than merely perpetuate it. The alchemical tradition provides a powerful metaphor for this process. Medieval alchemists worked with physical substances through specific operations, heating, dissolving, separating, combining, to transform base metals into gold. Jung recognized that these alchemical operations were actually projections of psychological processes, symbolic representations of the transformations that occur within the human psyche as it evolves toward greater consciousness and integration. In psychological terms, the base metal is our raw emotional pain, the suffering that comes from trauma, loss, failure, or disappointment. The gold is not the absence of this pain, but its transformation into wisdom, compassion, strength, and meaning. And the alchemical operations are the psychological processes through which this transformation occurs, processes that we can learn to engage with consciously rather than experiencing them as random suffering. Man I worked with, let's call him David, had experienced severe childhood neglect that left him with deep feelings of worthlessness and abandonment. For decades, he tried to escape these feelings through achievement, relationships, and various forms of self-medication. Nothing worked. The pain always returned, sometimes with even greater intensity. Through our work together, David began to approach his pain differently, not as something to escape, but as raw material for transformation. He learned to stay present with his feelings of worthlessness without being consumed by them, to explore their origins with compassion rather than judgment, and to recognize how these very wounds had given him unique sensitivities and strengths that were essential to his identity and purpose. Over time, his relationship with his pain fundamentally changed. The feelings didn't disappear entirely, but they no longer controlled him. Instead, they became integrated aspects of a larger, more complex identity, one that included both vulnerability and strength, both wounding and wisdom. His suffering hadn't vanished, but it had been transformed from a source of shame and avoidance to a wellspring of compassion for himself and others. This transformation illustrates the essence of emotional alchemy, not the elimination of pain, but its integration and transmutation into something valuable. The gold that emerges isn't the absence of suffering, but the presence of meaning, purpose, and wholeness that includes rather than excludes our wounds. So what are the signs that this alchemical process is occurring within you? How can you recognize that your pain is in the process of transformation rather than mere repetition? Let's explore the 7 signs that Jung identified as markers of this profound psychological alchemy. The first sign that you're transforming pain into power is a changing relationship with your dreams and inner imagery. Jung considered dreams the primary way the unconscious communicates with consciousness, offering symbolic messages about our psychological development that aren't available to the rational mind alone. When emotional alchemy begins, dream patterns often shift significantly. Dreams may become more vivid, memorable, or charged with emotion. Recurring dreams that have haunted you for years might transform, revealing new elements or outcomes. And certain symbolic themes typically appear, images of death and rebirth, transformation, or the integration of opposing forces. A woman I worked with, let's call her Rebecca, had suffered from childhood emotional abuse that left her with deep feelings of shame. For years she had recurring dreams of being exposed in public, naked, unprepared for an exam, or otherwise humiliated. As she began working alchemically with her shame, these dreams transformed. In one pivotal dream, she found herself naked in public, but feeling strangely peaceful about it, noticing that others seemed more uncomfortable than she was. In another, she discovered beautiful clothing appearing on her body as she walked confidently through a crowd. These dream transformations weren't random. They reflected the psychological work happening at deeper levels of her psyche, the gradual alchemical transformation of shame into self-acceptance and authentic expression. The dreams didn't simply disappear, but evolved to reflect her changing relationship with vulnerability and exposure. Beyond dreams, you may notice spontaneous imagery arising during quiet moments, meditation, or even daily activities, symbols, or scenes that seem to emerge from somewhere beyond your conscious creation. These images often carry emotional significance and may represent aspects of your psyche seeking integration or expression. Pay attention to recurring symbols or themes in both dreams and waking imagery. Animals often represent instinctual energies, seeking integration. Water frequently symbolizes emotion or the unconscious itself. Buildings or structures might represent your psychological framework or identity. The specific meanings are less important than the recognition that these images are communications from deeper parts of yourself, offering guidance for your alchemical process. The second sign of emotional alchemy is the appearance of meaningful synchronicities in your life. Jung defined synchronicities as meaningful coincidences, events that have no causal connection but seem meaningfully related, suggesting a connection between inner psychological states and outer circumstances. As you engage with the alchemical transformation of pain, you may notice an increase in these synchronistic events. Books fall open to exactly the passage you needed to read. You think of someone for the first time in years, only to receive a message from them moments later. Conversations with strangers mysteriously address exactly the questions you've been contemplating privately. Numbers, animals, or other symbols appear repeatedly in ways that feel personally significant. These synchronicities aren't random coincidences, but reflections of what Jung called the unus mundus, the unified reality that underlies both psyche and matter. As your conscious and unconscious mind come into greater alignment through the alchemical process, this underlying unity becomes more apparent in your experience, manifesting as meaningful connections between inner and outer events. A man I worked with, let's call him Michael, was struggling with a profound career transition following a painful job loss. As he began working alchemically with his feelings of failure and uncertainty, synchronicities began appearing with remarkable frequency. He would wonder about a potential new direction, only to receive an unexpected call about an opportunity in exactly that field. He would contemplate a question about his purpose, then open a book to find it addressed directly. A name would come to mind, and that person would contact him with exactly the connection he needed. These synchronicities weren't magical solutions to his problems, but they provided confirmation that he was aligned with a deeper process, that his conscious work was in harmony with unconscious development. They offered guidance and support at crucial moments, helping him navigate the uncertainty of transformation with greater trust and confidence. Pay attention to meaningful coincidences in your own life, particularly those related to your emotional challenges or questions. Rather than dismissing them as random, consider what message or connection they might be revealing. What alignment between inner and outer reality might they be reflecting? The increase in synchronicities often signals that your conscious and unconscious mind are coming into greater harmony through the alchemical process. The third sign of emotional alchemy is a growing attraction to specific symbols, images, or themes that seem to call to you with unusual power. This attraction often feels more than merely intellectual or aesthetic. It has a numinous quality, a sense of significance that goes beyond rational explanation. You might find yourself drawn to particular mythological figures, religious symbols, natural elements, or artistic motifs. Books on certain topics seem to find their way to you. Images or objects capture your attention and imagination in ways you can't fully explain. These attractions aren't random, but reflect archetypal energies becoming active in your psyche. Universal patterns of transformation seeking expression through specific symbolic forms. A woman I worked with, let's call her Julia, had experienced profound grief following multiple miscarriages. As she began working alchemically with this loss, she found herself inexplicably drawn to images and stories of the phoenix, the mythical bird that dies in flames and is reborn from its own ashes. She began noticing phoenix imagery everywhere, collecting representations that spoke to her, and feeling deeply moved by this symbol without initially understanding why. Through our work together, Julia came to recognize that the phoenix represented the transformative potential within her grief, the possibility of new life emerging from the ashes of loss. This symbol wasn't intellectually chosen, but seemed to choose her, appearing with a frequency and emotional resonance that signaled its psychological significance. It became a guide and companion in her alchemical process, offering a symbolic language for the transformation she was experiencing. Pay attention to what symbols, images, or themes attract you with unusual power during periods of emotional challenge. Rather than dismissing these attractions as random interests, consider what archetypal energies they might represent. What transformation might these symbols be pointing toward? How might they offer a language for understanding your own alchemical process? The fourth sign of emotional alchemy is a significant shift in the nature and quality of your relationships. As your relationship with your own pain transforms, your connections with others naturally begin to change as well, often in ways that reflect greater authenticity, depth, and mutuality. This relational shift typically involves several dimensions. First, you may notice changes in which relationships feel nourishing versus depleting. Connections that once seemed essential might begin to feel superficial or constraining, while new relationships emerge that support your authentic development. This isn't about judging others, but about natural resonance. As you change, your relational resonances naturally shift as well. Second, the quality of intimacy often transforms. Rather than relationships based primarily on roles, shared activities, or mutual need, you begin experiencing connections grounded in authentic presence and mutual recognition. There's less need to perform or please, more capacity to be genuinely yourself while allowing others the same freedom. Third, patterns of projection often shift dramatically. Jung defined projection as the unconscious attribution to others of qualities or emotions that actually belong to ourselves but that we haven't recognized or accepted. As emotional alchemy progresses, you begin withdrawing these projections, seeing others more clearly as themselves rather than as carriers of your disowned material. A man I worked with, let's call him Thomas, had experienced childhood emotional neglect that left him with deep fears of abandonment. For decades, he chose partners who were emotionally unavailable, unconsciously recreating his original wound while hoping for a different outcome. His relationships followed a predictable pattern: intense initial connection followed by increasing anxiety, controlling behaviors, and eventual painful separation. As Thomas began working alchemically with his abandonment fears, his relationship patterns gradually transformed. He became able to recognize his abandonment anxiety as it arose, holding it as his own, rather than projecting it onto partners through accusations or control. He developed greater capacity to self-soothe, rather than seeking constant reassurance. And perhaps most significantly, he found himself attracted to emotionally available partners, rather than those who would recreate his original wound. This relational transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't without challenges. Old patterns sometimes reasserted themselves, particularly during stress. But the overall direction was clear, from relationships based on unconscious reenactment of wounds to connections grounded in conscious awareness and authentic presence. Pay attention to shifts in your own relationships as you work with emotional pain. Notice which connections feel nourishing versus depleting, where you find yourself being more authentic, and how patterns of projection and reaction may be changing. These relational shifts often provide clear evidence of the alchemical transformation occurring within you. The fifth sign of emotional alchemy is a new relationship with your shadow, those aspects of yourself that you've rejected, denied, or never developed due to family or cultural conditioning. Jung considered shadow integration essential for psychological wholeness, writing, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." As emotional alchemy progresses, your awareness of shadow material typically increases. You begin recognizing patterns of projection more quickly, moments when your strong reactions to others reveal disowned aspects of yourself. You develop greater capacity to acknowledge qualities or emotions you've previously rejected, seeing how they might contain value or energy despite their challenging aspects. This shadow awareness often emerges first through relationships where our projections are most active and visible. You might notice yourself being intensely irritated by someone's behavior, then recognize with surprising clarity that you're reacting to a quality you've disowned in yourself. Or you might find yourself strongly admiring a trait in another, only to realize it's a positive potential you've never claimed or developed in yourself. A woman I worked with, let's call her Claire, had built her identity around being kind, helpful, and self-sacrificing. She was drawn to psychology out of genuine compassion, but found herself increasingly resentful of clients who didn't seem to appreciate her efforts. Through our work together, she began recognizing this resentment as a signal of shadow material seeking integration, specifically her disowned needs for recognition and reciprocity. As Claire worked alchemically with this shadow material, her relationship with both herself and her clients transformed. She developed capacity to acknowledge her own needs without shame, to set boundaries without guilt, and to recognize that her desire for appreciation was legitimate rather than selfish. This integration didn't make her less compassionate, but actually deepened her empathy by making it more authentic, grounded in genuine choice rather than compulsive self-sacrifice. The shadow integration that characterizes emotional alchemy isn't about indulging every impulse or eliminating all challenging emotions. It's about bringing previously unconscious material into relationship with consciousness, creating dialogue between different aspects of the psyche rather than allowing unconscious forces to operate autonomously. This integration releases energy that was previously tied up in repression and projection, making it available for creative expression and authentic connection. Pay attention to moments of surprising self-recognition in your own life. Times when you suddenly see yourself more clearly, particularly aspects you've previously avoided or denied. Notice patterns of projection in your relationships and emotional reactions. These growing moments of shadow awareness, while sometimes uncomfortable, signal the alchemical transformation of unconscious material into conscious integration. The sixth sign of emotional alchemy is the emergence of unexpected creativity, new forms of expression, insight, or problem-solving that seem to arise from somewhere beyond your familiar conscious resources. This creativity often has a quality of gift or grace, something received rather than achieved through willful effort alone. Jung recognized creativity as a natural outcome of the alchemical process, writing, "The creation of something new is not accomplished by the intellect, but by the play instinct acting from inner necessity." The creative mind plays with the objects it loves. As emotional pain transforms through the alchemical process, energy that was previously bound in suffering becomes available for creative expression and innovation. This creativity isn't limited to traditional artistic forms, though it may certainly include them. You might find yourself writing, painting, or making music with new depth and authenticity. But creativity might equally emerge as innovative solutions to practical problems, fresh approaches to work challenges, or new ways of navigating relationships. The common element is a sense of something new emerging that doesn't feel forced or contrived, but seems to flow from a deeper source. A man I worked with, let's call him James, had struggled with severe depression following a career failure. As he began working alchemically with his feelings of shame and worthlessness, he found himself spontaneously drawing, something he hadn't done since childhood. These weren't sophisticated artworks, but simple, intuitive expressions of his emotional experience. Over time, this creative practice deepened, eventually leading to a series of paintings that powerfully expressed his journey through depression toward new integration. What made this creativity significant wasn't its technical quality, but its authenticity and healing function. The creative process provided a language for emotions that had previously remained unexpressed, a container for experiences that had seemed overwhelming when held only internally. The creativity wasn't separate from the alchemical process, but an integral part of it, both expressing and furthering the transformation of pain into meaning and connection. Pay attention to new forms of creativity emerging in your own life, particularly during or following periods of emotional challenge. Notice what wants to be expressed through you, what images, words, movements, or innovations seem to arise from somewhere beyond your familiar conscious identity. This emerging creativity often signals the alchemical transformation of bound energy into free expression, of suffering into meaningful creation. The seventh sign of emotional alchemy is perhaps the most profound, the emergence of meaning and purpose from what previously felt like meaningless suffering. This doesn't mean that painful experiences are justified or that suffering is somehow necessary, but rather that through the alchemical process, even the most difficult experiences can be integrated into a larger narrative of meaning and purpose. Viktor Frankl, who survived Nazi concentration camps and developed logotherapy based on his experiences, wrote, "In some way, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning." Jung similarly recognized that meaning is essential for psychological endurance and transformation, writing, "Meaninglessness inhibits fullness of life and is therefore equivalent to illness. Meaning makes a great many things endurable, perhaps everything." This emergence of meaning isn't about imposing positive thinking on negative experiences or claiming that everything happens for a predetermined reason. It's about the human capacity to integrate even the most painful experiences into a coherent narrative that supports continued growth and contribution. It's about finding not why suffering happened to you, but what you will do with it now that it has. A woman I worked with, let's call her Eleanor, had experienced severe childhood trauma that left her with complex PTSD and chronic feelings of worthlessness. For decades, her suffering felt not only painful but meaningless, random cruelty that had permanently damaged her capacity for joy and connection. Through our work together, Elena gradually developed a different relationship with her trauma history, not denying its horror or its impacts, but recognizing how it had shaped her unique sensitivities, strengths, and values. Over time, Elena found herself drawn to work supporting other trauma survivors, not because trauma was good or necessary, but because her own experiences had given her insights and capacities that were genuinely helpful to others on similar journeys. Her suffering hadn't disappeared, but it had been integrated into a larger narrative of meaning and purpose that allowed her to live with greater wholeness and contribution. This emergence of meaning represents the culmination of emotional alchemy, the point at which pain has been transformed not by elimination, but by integration into a larger, more complex understanding of self and world. The suffering isn't erased from the story, but becomes part of a larger narrative that includes both wounding and healing, both pain and purpose. Pay attention to shifts in how you understand your own painful experiences, moments when what once seemed like meaningless suffering begins revealing unexpected gifts, insights, or capacities. Notice how your narrative about difficult experiences may be evolving to include not just what happened to you, but what you're creating from it. This emerging sense of meaning often signals the alchemical gold that can emerge from even the most painful human experiences. These 7 signs, changing dreams and inner imagery, meaningful synchronicities, attraction to specific symbols, transformation in relationships, shadow integration, emerging creativity, and the discovery of meaning, indicate that emotional alchemy is occurring within you. But how can you consciously participate in this process rather than simply hoping it happens spontaneously? What is Jung's secret method for facilitating this transformation? The method Jung developed for working alchemically with emotional pain combines several practices into a powerful approach for psychological transformation. At its core is what he called active imagination, a state of consciousness that bridges between waking awareness and the unconscious, allowing direct engagement with symbolic material without losing conscious participation. Unlike passive, fantasy or directed visualization, active imagination involves entering a receptive state where images and scenarios can emerge spontaneously from the unconscious while maintaining enough conscious awareness to interact with this material rather than being overwhelmed by it. It's a dialogue between consciousness and the unconscious, conducted through the language of symbol and imagination. To practice active imagination with emotional pain, begin by creating quiet, uninterrupted time and space. Sit comfortably and bring your attention to the emotional pain you wish to work with, not analyzing it intellectually, but simply feeling its presence in your body and psyche. Notice where and how you experience this pain physically. What sensations, tensions, or energies accompany it? Once you've made contact with the felt experience of the pain, ask inwardly for an image that represents or embodies this emotional experience. Don't try to create or control this image. Allow it to emerge spontaneously from your unconscious. It might be a person, animal, landscape, object, or abstract form. Whatever appears, receive it with curiosity rather than judgment. When an image has emerged, begin a dialogue with it. This can be verbal, written, or purely imaginal. Ask the image, what are you? Why have you appeared? What do you represent in Yi? My emotional experience? What do you need or want? Listen receptively for responses which might come as words, feelings, or further images. The key is maintaining genuine openness to what emerges rather than controlling or directing the process. As this dialogue develops, pay attention to how the image might transform. Does it change shape, color, or form? Does its emotional quality shift? Does it reveal aspects or dimensions that weren't initially apparent? These transformations aren't consciously directed, but emerge from the alchemical process itself. the natural movement of the psyche toward greater wholeness and integration. Man I worked with, let's call him Robert, used active imagination to work with profound feelings of worthlessness following a business failure. The image that emerged to represent his emotional pain was a heavy, dark stone in his chest. As he dialogued with this stone, it revealed itself as containing both the weight of his current shame and the accumulated pain of earlier experiences of failure and rejection. As Robert continued the dialogue over several sessions, the stone gradually began to transform, first revealing tiny sparks of light within its darkness, then slowly changing from an oppressive weight to a source of grounding and stability. Eventually it transformed into a kind of internal compass, still carrying the memory of painful experiences, but now offering guidance and wisdom derived from them. This transformation wasn't intellectually planned or forced, but emerged organically. From the dialogue between consciousness and unconscious, the pain hadn't simply disappeared, but had alchemically transformed into a different kind of presence, one that contained both the reality of suffering and the possibility of meaning and guidance emerging from it. Another powerful dimension of Jung's method involves working with the body as a vessel for alchemical transformation. Emotional pain isn't just mental, but is experienced physically, with specific sensations, tensions, and energies in the body. Conscious engagement with these physical dimensions can facilitate the alchemical process in ways that purely mental approaches cannot. Begin by bringing awareness to how you experience emotional pain in your body. Where do you feel it? What qualities does it have? Weight, temperature, texture, movement. Rather than trying to change these sensations immediately, first allow yourself to be fully present with them, creating space for their expression, rather than resistance or avoidance. From this place of embodied awareness, you might explore gentle movement that expresses or responds to these sensations. This isn't about performing specific exercises, but about allowing the body to find its own authentic response to emotional experience. What movements want to emerge? What does your body want to express or release? This somatic dimension often reveals aspects of emotional experience that aren't accessible through verbal or visual processing alone. A woman I worked with, let's call her Sophia, experienced chronic anxiety as constriction in her chest and throat. Through embodied awareness, she discovered that these sensations were connected to words and emotions that had remained unexpressed since childhood, particularly anger that had never been safe to acknowledge or express. As Sophia worked with these sensations, allowing movement and sound to emerge organically, she experienced profound release and transformation. The constriction didn't simply disappear, but gradually transformed into a different quality of energy, a sense of strength and boundary that could express itself appropriately rather than remaining trapped in chronic tension. This physical dimension of the alchemical process was essential for transformation that cognitive understanding alone couldn't achieve. The symbolic dimension of Jung's method involves working consciously with the symbols and archetypes that emerge during the alchemical process. These symbols aren't arbitrary, but reflect universal patterns of transformation that have been expressed across cultures and throughout history in myths, religious traditions, and alchemical texts. Familiarizing yourself with these symbolic patterns can help you recognize and work with them as they appear in your own experience. The hero's journey, death and rebirth, the sacred marriage of opposites, the wounded healer. These and other archetypal patterns provide maps for the territory of transformation, helping you recognize where you are in your own alchemical process. This doesn't mean imposing external meanings on your experience, but rather recognizing how your personal journey connects to universal human patterns. These connections can provide both guidance and reassurance, helping you understand that what feels like isolated personal suffering is actually part of the larger human experience of transformation and growth. A man I worked with, let's call him Daniel, was going through a profound midlife transition that included career change, relationship transformation, and spiritual questioning. As he worked with the emotional pain of this period, he found himself strongly drawn to the myth of Odysseus, the hero who must journey through many challenges and transformations before returning home with new wisdom. This mythic pattern helped Daniel recognized his own experience as part of a universal human journey rather than merely personal failure or confusion. It provided a framework for understanding the challenges he was facing, not as meaningless obstacles, but as initiatory experiences, tests and transformations necessary for the development of new capacities and identity. The symbolic dimension didn't replace his personal experience, but enriched it with deeper meaning and context. The relational dimension of Jung's method recognizes that emotional alchemy often requires witnesses and companions, others who can see and support our transformation without trying to fix, rescue, or control it. While much alchemical work happens internally, the presence of attuned others creates a container that can hold and facilitate transformation that might be too difficult to sustain alone. This relational container might be created through therapy, trusted friendships, community, or spiritual practice. The essential quality isn't professional credentials, but the capacity for presence, the ability to witness another's process with compassion and understanding without imposing solutions or expectations. This witnessing presence helps sustain the alchemical vessel when internal resources are strained by the intensity of transformation. A woman I worked with, let's call her Maya, was navigating profound grief following her mother's death. The alchemical process of transforming this grief required not just internal work, but relational holding, contexts where her experience could be witnessed without being fixed or rushed. Through both therapy and a grief support group, Maya found companions who could be present with the full range of her emotions, creating safety for the alchemical process to unfold. This relational dimension was particularly important when Maya encountered what Jung called the night sea journey, periods of darkness and disorientation that often precede new integration. During these times, the presence of others who understood this territory helped her trust the process even when her own trust faltered. The transformation wasn't accomplished by others, but was supported by their witnessing presence when the journey became most challenging. The creative dimension of Jung's method involves expressing and furthering the alchemical process through creative practices, not as mere self-expression, but as active participation in transformation. Writing, drawing, movement, sound, or other creative forms can externalize internal processes, making them more accessible to consciousness while also allowing them to develop beyond current understanding. This creative dimension isn't about artistic skill but about authentic expression, giving form to experiences, emotions, or insights that are seeking manifestation. The creative process itself becomes alchemical, transforming raw emotional material into expressions that both reflect and further the process of integration and meaning-making. A man I worked with, let's call him Thomas, used writing to work alchemically with feelings of betrayal following the end of a significant relationship. Rather than just journaling about his feelings, he engaged in dialogical writing, creating conversations between different aspects of himself, between himself and his former partner, and between himself and the experience of betrayal itself. This creative practice didn't just express Thomas's existing understanding, but generated new insights and perspectives. The writing became not just a record of his process, but an active participant in it, revealing connections, possibilities, and meanings that weren't apparent before they emerged through creative expression. The alchemical transformation happened, partly through the creative act itself, as raw emotion was given form and voice through the writing process. The final dimension of Jung's method involves conscious integration, the ongoing process of bringing alchemical insights and transformations into daily life and identity. This integration isn't a one-time event, but a continuous practice of embodying new understanding in concrete choices, relationships, and ways of being in the world. Integration might involve creating new rituals or practices that support transformed perspectives. It might mean making different choices in relationships based on greater self-awareness and authenticity. It might include changes in work, creative expression, or service that reflect new understanding of purpose and meaning. The key is that insights from the alchemical process aren't left in the realm of theory or occasional experience, but are gradually woven into the fabric of everyday life. A woman I worked with, let's call her Rebecca, experienced profound Transformation through working alchemically with childhood trauma. As this transformation deepened, she developed specific practices for integrating new awareness into daily life. Regular writing that connected her to authentic voice, boundaries that honored her needs and values, creative work that expressed her unique perspective, and service that transformed personal suffering into contribution to others. This integration wasn't perfect or complete. Old patterns sometimes reasserted themselves, particularly during stress, but the overall direction was clear. Insights and transformations from the alchemical process were gradually becoming embodied in concrete ways of living and relating. The gold that emerged from emotional alchemy wasn't just an internal experience, but a lived reality expressing itself through choices, relationships, and contribution. As you work with Jung's method for emotional alchemy, remember that transformation unfolds according to its own timing and wisdom. While conscious participation is essential, trying to force or control the process often creates resistance rather than flow. The alchemical approach involves both active engagement and receptive trust, working consciously with emotional pain while remaining open to transformations that may unfold in unexpected ways. This balance between conscious participation and receptive trust reflects what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's natural capacity to create new, third positions that transcend apparent opposites. Emotional alchemy isn't accomplished through conscious effort alone, nor does it happen automatically without engagement. It emerges through the dialogue between consciousness and the unconscious, between intention and surrender, between working with pain and allowing its natural transformation. Let's return to Sophia, the client I mentioned at the beginning who came to me after a devastating series of losses. Through working with Jung's alchemical method, Sophia's relationship with her pain gradually transformed. Using active imagination, she dialogued with images that represented her grief and loss, witnessing their gradual transformation from overwhelming darkness to symbols of depth and renewal. Through embodied awareness, she discovered how emotional pain manifested physically and found movements and expressions that facilitated its transformation. Through symbolic understanding, she recognized her experience as part of the universal human journey through loss toward new integration. Through relational holding in therapy and a support group, she found witnesses who could accompany her through the darkest passages of her transformation. Through creative practice, particularly writing and collage, Sophia externalized her internal process, discovering meanings and connections that weren't apparent through reflection alone. And through conscious integration, she gradually incorporated insights from her alchemical journey into daily choices, relationships, and a new sense of purpose that included both her losses and what she had created from them. "I still feel the pain of what I've lost," she told me toward the end of our work together. "But it's different now. It's not just emptiness and devastation anymore. There's something else too. A depth and understanding I didn't have before. A capacity to be present with others in their pain. A sense of what really matters that I don't think I could have learned any other way. The pain hasn't disappeared, but it's become part of something larger. Something that includes both suffering and meaning, both loss and new life." This transformation illustrates the essence of emotional alchemy, not the elimination of pain, but its integration into a larger, more complex wholeness. The gold that emerges isn't the absence of suffering, but the presence of meaning, purpose, and wisdom that includes rather than excludes our wounds. It's the discovery that our deepest pain, when worked with alchemically, can become not just a source of suffering, but a wellspring of our most profound gifts and contributions. As we conclude, I want to offer some final reflections on the gift hidden within emotional pain. Jung believed that what we experience as most painful often contains precisely what we most need for psychological development, the rejected, neglected, or undeveloped aspects of ourselves seeking integration through the language of suffering. This perspective transforms how we understand even the most difficult emotional experiences. Depression might reflect the psyche's need for depth and inward attention in a culture fixated on superficial positivity. Anxiety might contain wisdom about boundaries and self-protection that we've learned to ignore. Grief might open capacities for depth and connection that weren't accessible before significant loss. Even trauma, while never necessary or desirable, might develop unique sensitivities and strengths that become essential aspects of identity and purpose. When approached with this understanding, emotional pain becomes not just a problem to solve, but an invitation to transformation, a communication from the depths of the psyche offering exactly the material needed for the next stage of psychological and spiritual development. Its painful quality reflects not punishment or random suffering, but the significant energy contained in these communications and the importance of their integration for psychological wholeness. In practical terms, this means approaching your emotional pain with a fundamentally different attitude, not as an enemy to defeat, but as a messenger to engage with, not as meaningless suffering, but as purposeful communication, not as pathology to eliminate, but as potential wisdom seeking integration. This doesn't mean pain is good or necessary, but that when it does occur it can be worked with alchemically rather than merely endured or suppressed. As Jung wrote, "There is no birth of consciousness without pain." The alchemical perspective doesn't glorify suffering, but recognizes its potential role in psychological development when engaged with consciously. The pain itself isn't the purpose, but its transformation, the gold that can emerge from even the most difficult human experiences when they're approached not just as problems to solve, but as raw material for a profound alchemy of the soul. In Phi. The days and weeks ahead, I invite you to notice the 7 signs we've explored in your own experience. Pay attention to changing dreams and inner imagery, meaningful synchronicities, attraction to specific symbols, transformation in relationships, shadow integration, emerging creativity, and the discovery of meaning. These signs may indicate that emotional alchemy is already occurring within you, even if you haven't recognized it as such. And consider experimenting with Jung's method for facilitating this transformation, working with active imagination, embodied awareness, symbolic understanding, relational holding, creative expression, and conscious integration. These practices don't guarantee immediate transformation or the elimination of all pain, but they create conditions where alchemical change becomes possible, where what has appeared as meaningless suffering can gradually reveal itself as the raw material for your unique psychological gold. This alchemical journey isn't about achieving perfect wholeness or eliminating all challenging emotions. It's about engaging consciously with the full range of human experience, including its most painful aspects, in ways that transform rather than merely perpetuate suffering. It's about discovering that even our deepest wounds can become sources of wisdom, compassion, and purpose when worked with alchemically, rather than simply endured or avoided. As you continue your own journey of emotional alchemy, remember that transformation unfolds according to its own wisdom and timing. Some changes happen quickly, while others require patient engagement over months or years. Some insights arrive in dramatic moments of revelation, while others emerge gradually through consistent practice and attention. The alchemical process isn't linear but spiral, revisiting similar themes at deeper levels as integration continues, and perhaps most importantly, remember that you're not alone in this journey. The alchemical transformation of suffering into meaning and purpose is part of our shared human inheritance, a capacity that exists within you because it exists within the human psyche itself. Your specific path will be unique, but the underlying process connects you to both those who have walked similar paths before and those who will follow. In this recognition lies both comfort and responsibility, the knowledge that your personal alchemy contributes to our collective capacity for transforming pain into the gold of wisdom, compassion, and authentic power.